All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your Sunday. We have 3 weeks left, and I think we're going to find that each week has been building and building, and there's kind of a lot to go through today. So thank you. Hopefully, you'll get a lot out of it as well. We're at lesson 7, and we went through the relationship of our stewardship in our relationship to God, our stewardship in our relationship to ourselves, and now we're doing our stewarding our relationships with everyone else. And so later on, it'll highlight that we should be thinking about our family, our work, our church, our community, and the world. So kind of keep those 5 subgroups in mind. The main point is that God has called us to stewardship our relationships with others so that we may serve them and help them to flourish as God intended them to flourish. At church, at least at the downtown campus here, they've been really going into this whole pancake waffle metaphor. Have you guys gotten it at the East Campus too? Yes. And so today, I think, was really one of those where God's syrup of grace not only should be coming into us as the top pancake, but we should have so much of God's grace that it just runs off the side and affects the other people in our lives and seeps through us into the lower pancakes, right? Our family and the people around us. So I'm loving the sugar analogy through all of it. In previous lessons, we've also talked about how the vertical relationship between us and God is primary, and then it starts to affect all of our horizontal relationships. And you can see how it opens up in the guide here. Robert Kolb writes in The Christian Faith, in the horizontal relationship with other creatures of God, especially as human creations, we adults function as adults with responsibilities God has designed for us as those who represent him in meeting the needs of others and showing his love to those around him. Here, our righteousness consists in what we do for our neighbor, according to God's design for human beings. So the first 2 questions, feel free to answer. Tell us what you would or would not, if you would or would not give money to someone begging on the street. And if you had the power to change one problem in the world today, what would it be?
Like giving money, I'd rather go get like food or something.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not good.
No, I don't think that's bad at all. Did you guys hear her? She said she'd be more willing to give food or a gift, a clothes, as opposed to money to somebody on the street.
That's kind of my answer, is that I would give money, but I would want it to be used as God intended.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would give money to the people I pass every day. I see them like day in and day out. I had a student one time who was a drug addict, and he recovered, and he would bet, he told me not to give money to people on the corner outside of our school. He said, he told me straight up, they're going to use it for drugs. They're not going to use it for what you think. They can go anywhere they want to get. And, that kind of struck me as somebody coming from that background. But that's not to say I wouldn't freely give to somebody in need, or I wouldn't help them in some other way,
I think that's all of our worry, right? That in thinking we're helping, we end up enabling a very bad habit, and it doesn't help them. It actually could make their situation worse.
That's one reason I wouldn't do it.
Yeah. I know the church struggles with that a lot. people will come and ask the pastor directly or the church directly. And I've heard stories sometimes where they'll be telling a story about how they just need a tank of gas, right? We just need money for one tank of gas. And so the pastor will say, well, let me bring you down to the gas station. No, it's just better if you give me the cash. And you get a little red flag about what are they really planning on using this money for? But yeah.
We did a Trinity a couple years ago. This might have been 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was a youth group had made packages for the homeless during winter and had like blankets and socks. And I gave that away to one of these people that I passed by downtown St. Paul. And the guy was just thrilled. He asked me to bring more. And I was, that felt good. And he was happy.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
That was mentioned earlier at like the 10:30. That is beautiful. And there's something to thinking ahead, right? And being prepared. Somebody else said, I keep granola bars in my car and I can pass out some food, right? Or like a gift card to a gas station or McDonald's, something like that. And honestly, I just don't have cash. I don't carry cash anymore. So even but that can be, that's an excuse on my part, to say I couldn't help out because I don't carry cash anymore. How about that second question? If you had the power to change one problem in the world today, what would it be?
Get rid of hate.
Get rid of
And
hate.
this like polarizing.
And honestly, that was the first word that came to my mind too, was getting rid of hate. Thumbs up. The Leader's Guide gives me 2 stories to share, and they are opposite ends of the perspective on helping our neighbor. So story 1 goes, in the early hours of March 13th, 1964, 28-year-old American bar manager Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment building in Kew Garden, a neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens. 28-year-old Manhattan native Winston Mosley was arrested during a house burglary 6 days later, and while in custody confessed to her killing. At his trial, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. This sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. Mosley died in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81, having served 52 years. 2 weeks after printing a short article on the attack, the New York Times published a long report that conveyed a scene of indifference from neighbors who failed to come to Genovese's aid, saying 38 or 37 witnesses saw and heard the attack and did not call the police. The incident prompted inquiries into what became known as the bystander effect, or the Genovese syndrome. In contrast to this other story, in the early 1980s, Martin Leonard Lenny Skutnik was employed as a low-level government worker in the print shop of the Congressional Building Business Office. Likely his name would not be known today, except that on January 13th, 1982, something extraordinary happened. On that cold January day, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. The airplane clipped the 14th Street Bridge on takeoff and dropped into the ice-choking river, killing 74 passengers on board and 4 people on the bridge. Observing the rescue operations from the shore of the river, Lenny Skutnik, who was just a bystander, watched as Priscilla Toredo struggled to grab hold of a lifeline dropped to her from a rescue helicopter. As her hand slipped from the lifeline, she started to sink into the frozen river. Seeing the disaster unfold before him, Skutnik tore off his boots and coat and drove into the snow-bound Potomac River. After being dragged to the shore, Priscilla, though nearly frozen from the icy waters, was taken to the hospital and miraculously survived. As a result, Sputnik was rightfully hailed as a hero. Although he had no training as the first responder, he didn't need it. He simply saw someone in need and acted without hesitation, the proverbial Good Samaritan. Two situations with two completely different outcomes. Some fail to act when they can, and others act quickly and decisively to help. Jesus told a parable that contains both kinds of responses. Have you guys heard those two stories before or something like it? Psychology was my minor, and that first story of all the bystanders not doing anything was very memorable. The details about it, and it was a long attack. And so there was ample time for somebody to do something. And some people got like kind of close to it, but then turned back. And it was very shameful, right, for the community when they realized that all these people, but that's the idea that somebody else will help. I don't need to. There's so many other people around. Somebody else will do it. But the problem is that everybody has that mentality, and then nobody did anything. So the story of the Good Samaritan is surprisingly brief. I didn't appreciate that until looking it over today. So I think it's worth reading aloud. It is in Luke 10. Does anybody else have it open? You certainly don't have to. I've got it, so I'll go ahead and read it. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite. When he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. When he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went with him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." How would you answer the question, who is your neighbor?
Everybody.
Everybody. I would even say everyone in need, which is also everybody.
It's very easy to say everybody, like the whole world, people I've never met before, people I will never meet. But to me, in this story, your neighbor happens to be anybody within a distance of you that you encounter. I mean, somebody on the opposite side of town who's in trouble, although maybe they, yes, in a greater sense, they're a neighbor.
Mhm.
What am I going to do to help them? But somebody whom I pass by and is a stranger, and I'm in close proximity to them, all of a sudden now they're my neighbor.
Mhm,
at least for a little while.
mhm. In the, at the end of the study, it highlights how are you going to use what we've talked about to help the people in your world? And it doesn't say the extended world. I was a little surprised it didn't go out that far, but that might be one of the reasons why. It focuses on family, church, work, and community. So there is something to having that line of sight or even that arm's reach where that's enough to think about as being your neighbor. I think there's certainly enough challenges right there to keep us humble and to keep us busy. I hadn't, I don't know, there were two things that kind of stood out, that he was an expert in the law and he was a lawyer. But I'm thinking that the law they're referring to is the law of God. And so it's more like he would be a church lawyer, because he wasn't talking about Roman law or something like that. He was quoting the Torah when he said, when God, what is written in the law, he quotes the Old Testament. So I don't know, has anybody ever heard more about the man with him being a lawyer? Because he's not a priest. I get that they had different duties, but it would make sense that they would have Bible lawyers, Old Testament lawyers back then too. Another thought to maybe twist the story around for you, since it's so familiar to all of us. I've heard that every story in the Bible is really about Jesus and his love for us. And so,
That's what I thought about in the sermon today, like, oh, wait.
yeah,
He's
kind
coming
of-
back. That's what
Yeah.
hit me.
And so are we to think of ourselves as the person passing on the road, as the Good Samaritan? Or should we also think of ourselves as the person in need of mercy? And then I feel like the lawyer should have just stopped while he was ahead. This was like, it ended very peacefully after verse 28. And he said to him, "You have given the right answer, do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And then put himself in that position to be called out, right? As somebody who's maybe not, even though he has the head knowledge, it wasn't reaching his heart yet. I'm still trying to process about why he asked another question, and the leader's guide gives some background into that. He says, the lawyer, instead of testing Jesus, now becomes defensive, wishing to justify himself. His defensiveness comes from his knowledge that he has put into an untenable position. He knows that if he claims he does love God, he should love his neighbor as well. To profess love for God, to hate one's neighbor, and to hate one's neighbor is hypocrisy. If the lawyer professes to love his neighbor as himself, someone can ask, where is the evidence? This is the point at which the lawyer really starts to squirm. He tries to deflect attention away from himself by implying that the law is the problem. And by that, I think that it's the Old Testament law, that the Bible, right, is the problem. That the law is unclear. It is necessary to clarify who is neighbor and who is not, to define between us and them. The question, who is my neighbor, implies that there are some people who are not my neighbor. And by that, I would think also means someone who doesn't deserve God's grace or doesn't deserve my mercy. I know.
Everybody should deserve it.
I had never thought about that one question as kind of that far reaching. So I really do appreciate the commentary here. By asking the question, the lawyer asked Jesus to interpret the Torah. Okay, so yeah, the Old Testament, as to the kinds of people Jesus would exclude from his love. Anyone even vaguely familiar with Jesus' ministry up to this point should know that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament in this ministry. Absolutely no one is excluded from his love. So I thought that was having a better perspective about where this lawyer is coming from and why Jesus asks him this really hard question, right? Kind of puts him in this awkward position where he has to squirm. And I can say, I feel like there are times where we'll also feel like the Bible is the problem when it's not, right? It's our lack of understanding about the Bible that is a time for growth, as opposed to thinking that the Bible is wrong in some way. Question, any other comments about the lawyer or the why he asked the question, who is our neighbor? So question 10, why do you suppose the priests and the Levite passed him by on the other side and did nothing to help?
The Bible says they were unclean, so they're going to their work.
Mm-hmm.
They can't be unclean.
It's Carol was saying if they got involved, they would be ritually unclean and it would mess up their job and the purpose of them traveling. And they had obviously traveled to do this job. So there was a lot that would be messed up if they weren't able to do that.
Pastor Mark this morning talked about it as that, but then kind of summarized it as they had better things to do, or they had more important things to do.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that. When I'm passing somebody on the street, I'm like, I am not backing up traffic to try to lean out my window and I'm on my way to work. I'm running errands. Absolutely, I will put myself before helping somebody else in those ways. And honest, and another reason that they listed here is you put yourself in danger in some of those situations. Thinking back to that opening story, there was a bad man on the street hurting somebody. And so for you to try to help, you are also putting yourself in danger. So there's something to that self-preservation. Why would it be unusual for a Samaritan to stop and help the man? So the history goes back to the Old Testament, and there was really bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans. And so the leader's commentary points out that the famous hatred between the Jews and Samaritans went all the way back to the division of Israel's kingdoms at the beginning of Rehoboam's reign. After the northern tribes broke away from the southern ones, there was constant friction between the two halves of the divided kingdom. From a Jewish perspective, the term Samaritan implied a polluted bloodline and a deficient religious practice. It was almost a curse, right, to call somebody a Samaritan. Concerning the relationship between these two groups, John's gospel says simply, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Given this long-standing animosity, one would not have expected a passing Samaritan to help the half-dead Jewish victim. Yet Jesus says that this Samaritan had compassion. This verb means literally that his innards moved. The Samaritan was compelled to help despite the cost of danger that it might involve. Another thought I had was I always envision the Jew as being unconscious through this process. And maybe he's not, right? What does he feel about a Samaritan helping him? I think the Samaritan is doing the right thing, but he's especially doing the right thing if the Jew that he's trying to help is resistant, or I don't know, calling him names. I don't know. It was just a funny thought I had, that not just helping this helpless victim, but even a reluctant victim at that.
What this kind of strikes me as interesting, an interesting point of view. Obviously, we get the Bible version from the Jewish half, right? But like, just because these two had bad blood, the story, or at least as the person hearing it, we almost assume that this Samaritan, because of their title, is like not a good person, right? And I think a lot of times in modern day, we as Lutherans or Christians, we can say Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and we almost assume or presume that they are a Samaritan, right? But like, these are still generally good people. But I think maybe when I say it out loud like that, maybe my mind needs to be focused more on just the indifference in between the two people in the story, and not putting judgment upon this other person.
I think there's something to that this story is breaking down a stereotype, and that we should exactly think about people as individuals, even regardless of what their background is, and to be conscious of where our stereotypes, right, are, and then to be, like I say, just be thoughtful about that, so that you're not overgeneralizing. And how would other Samaritans feel about him helping a Jew, especially when other Jewish people didn't? Yeah. Number 13, how did Jesus answer the question, who is my neighbor, for the lawyer? Oh, I skipped 12, didn't I? Sorry. What did the compassion the Samaritan felt for the victim move him to do? Help?
To the point of paying if he needed more help, and to come back and check on him.
It's the golden rule, straight out. I mean, there's your short answer. And like Carol was saying, it wasn't just stopping and checking on him. He also mended his wounds. He also put himself in danger, because those robbers could have still been around. He also gave up his donkey. He also brought him and spent the night with him, talking about messing up your plans. He also gave money, and he also was going to come back and check on him. I've never helped a stranger like that. Talk about above and beyond. And I think it would be a lot to hand out a gift card, it's very humbling to read this story. How did Jesus answer the question, who is my neighbor, for the lawyer?
The one who showed mercy.
The one who showed mercy. Yep. And I was trying to look up the difference between grace and mercy, because I kind of use them interchangeably. Grace is an unmerited gift. And mercy is compassion or forgiveness shown towards someone who it's within our power to punish or harm. What do you have written down?
God, grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. Mercy is not getting what we deserve. We deserve eternal judgment and we don't.
Okay. So they obviously go back and forth there a lot.
Yeah.
I thought the mercy definition was interesting because you're choosing not to punish someone when you could or should. And that they think that the Samaritan is showing mercy, but he wasn't intentionally hurting him, but he had the freedom to walk by the way that the priest and the Levite did. And I wonder if that's where it's mercy instead of grace kind of. Yeah. So anyway, that was just a side note that I was thinking about, because we're in the church examples and in the sermon examples, grace is the syrup, right? We're not highlighting the word mercy as much. So I was just seeing how that differentiated coming out in the story here. Once the who is my neighbor question is answered, two additional questions follow. They are, what is my attitude toward my neighbor? What should our attitude be towards our neighbor?
Loving,
Loving.
caring.
I was gonna say one word. Yep. That golden rule.
Mark talked a lot about generosity this morning at the East Campus.
I think that's a perfect word, right? For this story. Like I say, he just kept going and going and giving to this man on the road. It's to not be self-centered, but to be God-centered. And so that leads to maybe a more challenging question of, what is my responsibility toward my neighbor?
The story says it. Show mercy. Go and do what he did.
Show mercy, go and do what he did. I think
Looking out for each other,
Mhm.
having an awareness, looking even just beyond ourselves, seeing what's happening around us, paying attention.
Isn't that true? I mean, you can get such tunnel vision and kind of caught up in your own world that you don't even see the people on the street anymore. Or people see your coworker who needs a friend to talk to, or to go out for a drink after work and have a friend, right? In that kind of environment too. The story leads us to think about the homeless person on the street, but remember to consider your family, whether that's your immediate family or your extended family, because sometimes they're the hardest to love. And then our work, our church, and our community. Yeah, because the stewardship is a sacrifice, right? We're already committing time to God. We're already committing time to ourselves. And so to commit time to other people is a big ask. That love is a commitment and a responsibility. And something else that came up today is that it is a struggle, but that to appreciate that the struggle creates character. I'll wrap up that section with a quote from the Leader's Guide. An important comment in the parable, Robert Sorensen in his Reformation Heritage Bible Commentary, Luke writes, the famous parable of the Good Samaritan leaves no doubt that Jesus expects his followers to do good to all people. However, his concluding exhortation, go and do likewise, reminds us just how far we are from the loving, self-sacrificing behavior the Lord expects. So it was that Jesus became the Good Samaritan for us. He laid down his life and befriended us while we were yet enemies. He promised us full restoration and the life everlasting. I think there's going to be good discussion in the application and what should I do. And so with your blessing, given that there are so many verses, I'm going to give you the answer key. So what do the following passages have to say about our relationship with God? Leviticus, do not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your neighbor. You know, at the East Campus, I hope you're reading the scripture the same way we are at the West Campus. When it's kind of read responsibly. And so when we as our congregation said, dear Lord, help me to not hold a grudge against my neighbor, I had to bump my tongue a little bit. I was like, yeah, I should pray that daily. Do what Isaiah, do what is right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, and care for widows and orphans. Matthew, do to others as you would have them do to you. Romans, do not judge one another and do not put stumbling blocks in their path. 2 Corinthians, we proclaim Christ to our neighbors, just as Paul did. Galatians, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Galatians, carry each other's burdens. Ephesians, we are to speak the truth to our neighbor. Colossians, forgive one another as Christ has forgiven you. 1 Thessalonians, encourage one another to build one another up. Hebrews, show hospitality to strangers. 1 Peter, be like-minded, sympathetic, compassionate, and humble. And 1 Peter, steward faithfully the gifts God gives you to benefit your neighbor. I'm sure they struggle to even limit this verse selection to those 10 or so. It's just over and over and over again, right? It's all about how do you treat your neighbor? Love God, love your neighbor. Any comments or other verses that came to mind during those? So in the application, as we consider the privilege and responsibility of stewarding our relationships with others, we must first look at our own lives and consider how we view and treat our neighbors. In his book, Stewards of the Kingdom, Roden lists 3 ways neighbors are treated. How can we have a closer relationship with God? So we could think of our neighbors as gift versus means. How are neighbors treated if they are seen as a gift? I get excited about gifts. I like gifts. Look forward to them. Value them. If they are, how are neighbors treated if they are seen as a means to an end? Maybe it's I'll lend you my shovel if you lend me your rake, right? It's It's not a sacrificial relationship. It's a means to an end. I'll be nice to you so that you keep your radio down. If you think about your physical neighbor that way. And it turns into how can I use them versus how can I serve them? With versus against. What does it mean to live with your neighbor?
No fences.
I gotta say though, good fences make good neighbors. But to live with them, right? That they're a creature of God. Whether we're in the same blood family or the same neighborhood, the same church community, we're with them. As opposed to being against them or maybe some kind of a competition, making judgments against them, putting up barriers, emotional walls. Keeping up with the Joneses, that would be more of a competition, some working against them instead of being just genuinely happy for whatever they do have. They had a quote in here from Rodin. When we are measuring not by how well we live amongst our neighbors, but how well we have done in competition with our neighbors, we define success according to the standards of the world. Therefore, we are successful to the extent that we stand out as having amassed more, achieved more, experienced more, earned more, and enjoy more life than our neighbors. So that's the kind of competition. That's what they mean when they're talking about that word there. Caring versus, and then the third way is to think about caring versus competing. How are we to care for our neighbors? Jeez. You just can't care for somebody unless you're involved with them.
Mhm.
And that takes your emotional energy and your time to do that. But if you don't care for them, if you don't get to know them, how do you know what their real needs are? Right? It's not the money, it's something that they're hoping the money will give them. So congratulations, we are the first group to actually make it to the what should I do section. As we dive into this is kind of an open forum. I think I want to go back and hear Pastor Mark's sermon, right? I think Denny Hartung was filling in for Pastor Bender, and he did a wonderful job. But I'm right from what Sarah's been saying about Pastor Mark's, I'm kind of curious. I want to listen to that one too. Robert Cole writes in The Christian Faith, in the horizontal relationships with the rest of creation, he has structured 4 situations for human service. These are the situations of home, occupation, society, and congregation. In each of these situations, God has fashioned responsibilities for his human creatures, abilities, which enables his creation to function through human activities. They respond to needs within the community God has designed for their daily lives. In every relationship I have, whether at home, at work, in church, or in my community, my responsibilities as a steward is to help every neighbor flourish as God intends them to flourish. So what are something that you can do at home? Listen. I tell you, turn off the electronic devices.
I think we talked, Pastor Mark talked about like sacrificial love. When you have a family, oftentimes you must sacrifice your own probably wants and sometimes needs to give others what they need or want.
Mm. I tell you, I'm an audiologist, right? So I help people hear better. Some people just don't want to hear better. It's very frustrating. And so I always joke that our minors should be in marriage counseling, because couples come in hot on the topic of, is there hearing loss? Why isn't he wearing his hearing aids? You know, all that kind of stuff. And along those lines, I think we get really comfortable with our loved ones, and we can put on our patient face, our compassionate face at work or with strangers better than we can with our loved ones. Like, we expect more grace from them, but we're just not in tune to putting it out in quite the same way. You'll yell from the other room with the TV going, where you would never do that with your friends. You know, you're going to sit down and have a conversation if you're having, anyway. So, right, to stay engaged with that compassion, with that keeping the grace turned on when you're at home as well. Yeah, it is sacrificial love. How about at work?
This one was a good reminder for me at church today. It's like very simplistic, but he basically reminded us, like, when you're like specifically at work, thinking about the people that I interact with at work. He said something like, you know, Jesus died for every single one of those people. And like, just this really simple reminder, and like the environment that I work in, especially lately, has been very tense and unpleasant, and a lot of bad behavior happening among people. And it's really easy to go to work and just feel disheartened and discouraged and frustrated and angry and all the things. And I was like, like, what if I go to work tomorrow, just like with that reminder at the forefront of my mind, like, how different would my attitude be? It just kind of gave me some hope, I guess, actually, this morning, hearing him like reminding us of that. And like, I don't know.
I think that's critical, right? Because we're called to think differently
Mhm.
about things, and we need that support to do it, because it's really hard to go against the flow.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad that you have that support, or motivation from the sermon. That's exactly why we go to church, right?
Yeah, it was a good reminder.
Yeah. And how about at church? How can we serve our neighbor at church?
Be aware of needs and volunteer.
Mhm. You can't know what the needs are unless you're involved, right? Whether that's with a human being or with the church. And the last situation that it asks about is in the community.
I think similar to what I mentioned earlier, like, pay attention, look around, see where people do have needs, or see what shows up if you do just pay attention, and then try to be helpful in whatever that looks like. I think it's easy to just tune, like, you know, as the spheres get bigger, like start tuning things out and just trying to pay attention, or I don't know.
I absolutely agree. It's hard to divide your attention in 10 different ways.
Mhm.
But at 10:30, different things came up, and it made me realize how blessed we are in this community. But there is still need. We also have several groups, programs readily available to help, whether it's something like We Do Feed, where furniture is available, we have food shelves, different churches run different meal programs. And so being aware of how you, even if you're not going to directly help somebody who seems to need it, to be able to refer them on to a group that is better able to support them with something like Grace Place or whatever it might be. And I know that the church has like a list of resources that has been put out at like We Do Feed and things like that, but just to be able, right, ready in a moment to provide some of that contact information, I think would be, is good to keep in mind too. Any other comments about the services today or anything that stood out in the Bible study here? Well, thank you again for taking your time. Hopefully you'll leave thinking about something, ruminating over something until the next week. We have 2 more weeks. And I want you to get out your calendar when we finish with the prayer and put on there that you're going to come to the A Few More Hours event coming up November 13 and 14. So the idea is that everybody will go and get some great food and then talk about the future, your vision for Trinity. So you go to one or the other. It's just that if the Sunday doesn't work for you, there's a Monday available or vice versa. All right, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father,
Father,
you have called us into community.
community.
It is
It is
your
your
will
will
that we love our neighbor
As
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 you
we love
love
you.
us. You
You
demonstrated
demonstrated
that
that
love
love
by
by
giving
giving
your
your
own
son
son
to die.
to die for us.
Empower us
through
through
your
your Holy Spirit
To see people
people
as you see them
see them
and to serve
and to
them.
serve them
them
all to your glory.
In
Jesus'
Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. All right, guys, have a blessed week. Bye now.
Thank you.
I.
Good night.